Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into how the Jewish people must be the chosen people, because there's no other reason why we still exist. Let's get started. This past week, an old friend and a very big fan of this podcast posted to her personal Instagram account a photo that caught my eye. Some of you may have seen this photo making the rounds online, or maybe seen the movie itself, but it is a screenshot from the 2019 movie Jojo Rabbit, with the caption, quote, "There are no weak Jews. I am descended from those who wrestle angels and kill giants. We were chosen by God." These references are from the Torah. Like in Genesis 32, our patriarch Jacob was visited by someone that he thought was a man, but it really was an angel of God, and the two of them wrestled all night. After successfully wrestling with the angel of God, he demanded that this angel give him a blessing. His name was then changed from Jacob to the very appropriate name Israel, which can be translated to be God preserves. This is a very fitting name for the nation that he will father, the nation of Israel, a nation that has struggled in every generation for their survival. I, of course, told my friend how much I loved this caption, and we began a quick discussion about how it's nothing short of a miracle that the Jewish people, or the nation of Israel, still exists today. This is something that should be statistically impossible. It made me think that this could be a great topic for this week's podcast. I wanted to look into the impossible success of the Jewish people to survive thousands of years against literally all odds. I'm not sure if there could be any other explanation for the survival and success of the Jewish people, other than the fulfillment of the prophetic claim that God has chosen the Israelite people for a special place in this world, and therefore we will forever be protected by God. According to the book of Genesis, chapter 17, God said, quote, "I will maintain my covenant between me and you and your offspring to come, as an everlasting covenant throughout the ages, to be God to you and to your offspring to come. I assign the land that you sojourn in. You and your offspring will all come to the land of Canaan, as an everlasting holding, and I will be their God." Normally, I wouldn't try and preach that I believe that these prophetic writings are real. I would say that I'm much more of an academic and rational person. However, maybe by the end of this episode, you may also agree that there's something incredible happening here. That the Jewish people are still here after thousands of years appears to be nothing short of a miracle. One of the most notable things that has happened to the Israelite people in their history is an exile from their ancient homeland of Israel or Judea. Following the death of King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel splits into two, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel was attacked by the Assyrian Empire, and many of the inhabitants were exiled from their land to live within the growing Assyrian Empire. Part of the policy of the Assyrian leadership was to move their conquered people around to ensure that they were less able to rebel. This was sadly the fate of the so-called lost tribes of Israel. Those Israelites who did remain within the newly conquered land of Israel were joined by other Assyrian conquered peoples. According to the stories in the Bible, many of these Israelites intermarried and introduced some non-Jewish religious aspects into their societies and lives. There is some debate on whether these former Israelites, now known as Samaritans, were still, quote, Jewish in the religious sense or not. Unfortunately, exile had a negative effect on those who were conquered by the Assyrians. There was a somewhat similar outcome for the Phoenician people who lived nearby. Phoenicia was an ancient civilization composed of independent city-states along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. This stretched through what is now known as Syria, Lebanon, and northern Israel. Starting in 1200 BCE, the first wave of Phoenician people entered the Levant to set up trading centers. Their colonies grew until the Persian leader Artaxerxes III sacked Sidon, one of the main Phoenician cities. This was followed by Alexander the Great, who attacks a number of Phoenician cities too, before taking over the entire region. This would essentially be the end of the Phoenician people and their culture. It was essentially removed from the map by exile or assimilation. The Phoenician people are no longer here today. This was not an unusual issue, because it was the same situation for the Judean people. The southern kingdom of Judah had survived the Assyrian assault by what some would call a miracle. However, it was not so lucky when Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, attacked Jerusalem and destroyed Judah and their temple in Jerusalem. The Babylonians took over much of the Middle East and exiled many of the Judean people to Babylon, and those who were left in Israel were left without a temple to their God. After the Babylonians came the Persian Empire, until they fell at the hands of the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and then the Romans. The same empires that ended the Phoenician people did not put an end to the Judean people. Those Judeans who were in exile in Babylon continued to look and pray towards Jerusalem with the hope that they would one day return. They never gave up on their religion, faith, or belief. In fact, it was in Babylon during the exile when the Babylonian Talmud was compiled, a book that Jews today still use for their understanding of practicing Judaism. Once the Babylonian Empire was finished, at the hands of the growing Persian Empire and Cyrus the Great, Cyrus decided to allow the exiled peoples in his kingdom to return to their homelands. Cyrus also approved and supported the Judean people rebuilding their temple to God in Jerusalem in 536 BCE. Many Judean people returned to Judea, and others chose to stay in Babylon. The Babylonian Jews did not give up on their religion and or culture, and they continued to live as Judeans, or Jews, in Iraq and Iran until they were forced to flee after the reestablishment of the modern state of Israel. The Judeans who returned to Judea from Babylon rededicated themselves to their religion and their God. They rebuilt their temple in Jerusalem, where it stood for many more years. After the second temple was built and destroyed, again, this time by the Romans in the year 70 CE, Judeans were once again exiled from their country and taken to Rome as enslaved peoples. These people, like the Judeans of Babylon, never forgot their religion and culture and continued to practice Judaism in Rome. Today, Rome boasts one of the oldest continuous Jewish populations outside of the land of Israel. Jews have lived and practiced their Judaism in exile over 2,000 years in Rome. Babylon would have been a longer diaspora community had it not been for the population being expelled in 1948. Unlike the Israelites of the northern tribe, the Phoenicians, and countless other countries, cultures, and religions facing conquest and exile, the Judean people never forgot their culture, religion, and homeland. Against all odds, the Judeans survived and thrived. In addition to exile, part of the issues about being conquered by a superpower is that they tend to colonize the region. Even when exiling populations, those who stayed behind faced the colonization forces. Whether that was the introduction of foreign religious practices like in Samaria, or outright destruction through assimilation like the Phoenicians, exiled peoples rarely ever survive their exile. For those people who are not expelled from their homes to another part of a vast empire, stay in their homes, but this time under a much different leadership than they once had. In many cases, colonizers attempt to help assimilation in these newly conquered lands by putting up temples to their gods and banning religious practices of the local deities and religions. This can and has gone as far as destroying the temples and religious practices of the current religion in the land. We saw this with the Hellenization of the Levant, where the Greeks pushed their culture and religion on their newly conquered peoples. We saw a direct example of this story in the Maccabean Revolt. The Greek colonizers attempted to ban Jewish rituals to push their own religious beliefs on the people. They went as far as to install a Greek-friendly Jewish priest to be high priest in the temple, and they try and sway the people to be more pro-colonization. As many of you probably know, the Jewish people under the Maccabees, a priestly family, removed the Hellenization from the Jewish religious practice and rededicated their temple to God. Against all odds, the Judeans were able to overcome the threat of Hellenization and restore the Jewish practice for many more years in the Jerusalem temple. However, after the Greeks were taken over by the Romans, they too pushed their views on the area. Many attempts were made to try and bring the Roman province of Judea under the Roman control. The Romans had not experienced a group that were so unwilling to accept colonization. Many countries that they took control over were already colonized by the Greeks, and therefore had a much easier time switching their religious beliefs from Greek gods to Roman gods. This was a great feature of polytheism. Add this god here, change that god name there, it didn't really bother anybody. However, as had been the case throughout history, the Judeans had always been a thorn in the side of the Roman colonizers. So much so that the Romans had to dispatch and keep more soldiers in this tiny area of Judeans because of their continuous revolts against the Roman power. In a final act of retaliation, the Romans once and for all destroyed the second Jewish temple, the religious center of the Judean people, as punishment for their refusal to accept Roman colonization. Even further, the Romans wanted to really rub salt in the wounds of the rebellious Judeans and rename their region after their greatest enemies of their past, the Philistines. They renamed their territory Syria Palestina and changed Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. In addition to this insult, the Romans banned all Jews from their capital city, except for on Tisha B'Av to remember the destruction of the temple. The Romans also put a temple to Jupiter on the spot where the Judean temple once stood. They wanted to once and for all stamp out the Jewish presence on the Temple Mount, and finally put an end to the Jews as a religious group. Maybe once their temple was destroyed, they would finally give in and pray to Jupiter. This colonization continued as the Romans were overtaken by the Christian Byzantines and Muslim rulers. The temple to Jupiter on the top of the Jewish Temple Mount became the Dome of the Rock, a Muslim holy site, and the ban in Jerusalem continued. With the banning of Judeans from visiting their temple, killing and exiling Judeans to Rome as slaves, and putting the full force of the Roman Empire against the Judeans, they should have been wiped out, given up, and been beaten to submission. But this was not the case. Against any and all colonization attempts, the Judeans all over the world refused to give up their beliefs, practices, and hope for a rebuilt Jerusalem. If you look at any other group under the same colonization attempts, we do not see clearly the same amount of struggle to survive. As an example, if you listen to our previous podcast, Arab Colonization, we saw the scale and speed in which the Muslim conquest of the entire Middle East and North Africa took place. To this day, it is very clear and obvious to see a Muslim influence in the entire region. All of the Muslim nations in the Middle East can thank their beliefs and practices on colonizing forces. Similarly, the growth of Christianity across Europe and Asia is a direct result of the Byzantine colonization of the region. If you look at a map today of the Middle East and North Africa, and you have Muslim nations in red and Christian nations in blue, most of the world would be in one color or another. One of the very few nations that would be right in the middle, the only uncolored country, is the modern state of Israel. This tiny place has miraculously withstood incredible pressure of two colonizing forces that took over the world. It almost seems impossible, especially since technically the region had been taken over numerous times by both of these colonizing forces, only to be reestablished as an independent Jewish state in 1948, after generations of colonization attempts. I struggled to find any other indigenous people who had been under so many occupations and colonizations that have been able to reestablish their own self-governance in their ancestral homeland. Even though the Jewish people had always longed for their ancestral homeland while in exile or under colonization, the world did not see a need until it was unfortunately too late. Many people wrongly suggest that the modern state of Israel only exists today because of the events of the Shoah, or the Holocaust. In fact, a re-established Israel has been a dream of the Jewish people since their first exile and colonization. Steps towards re-establishing an independent Jewish state on the land has happened over and over throughout history. Whether it was the Maccabees, Bar Kokhba revolt, or the Irgun, the Jewish people had been fighting to reclaim their land for generations, and never stopped. The Jewish nation, through people like Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, and Theodor Herzl, have tried to use political and non-violent means to get an independent state for the Jewish people on their ancestral homeland. However, the Holocaust was a time when the world finally realized how important it was to stop blocking the Jewish demands for an independent state. Unfortunately, it came at a massive cost. There are many scholars and survivors who have their own ideas on how and why something like the Holocaust happens. I won't have time to go into all of these theories here. For the purposes of this episode, we will be looking at the fact that the Jewish people somehow survived this genocide, in itself being somewhat of a miracle. It is also a miracle that the religious persecution that led to the Holocaust did not end the Jewish people, as it was intended. Throughout Jewish history in the diaspora, the Jewish people have been subjected to more hate and violence than any other group. Whether it's pogroms, forced conversions, expulsions, or any other form of hate, the Jewish people have somewhat survived against all odds. I guess we should be thankful that there are no real comparisons that can be made to these situations in scale and scope. No other religious or cultural group has been targeted across the globe over this many thousands of years, like the hate and violence that has happened against the Jewish people. The fact that the Jewish people have not only survived, but been able to maintain their religious traditions in spite of these threats is nothing short of a miracle, and possibly an act of God. One of the last things that we could look at as a miracle for the survival of the Jewish people in their homeland is the fact that they're still here today, against all odds. Many of you who have heard my many episodes on the history of Israel and the wars that have happened would know that they have defied all odds in surviving. As a comparison, if we look at the modern conflict happening within Ukraine, where a powerful adversary, Russia, has invaded them with somewhat superior numbers and equipment. Many people today think about how impossible Ukraine's survival is against Russia, and particularly thank the NATO nations for their financial and military support of the Ukrainian people. I'm not sure of how many people would put their money on Ukraine if they were on their own against such an overpowering force without the help of others. This is nothing in comparison to what was the War of Independence for Israel. In 1948, a new nation made up of untrained civilians and Holocaust survivors was attacked by 7 modern armies, funded and trained for many years by the Soviet Union and the West. Israel did not have any real support from the West and was not able to receive, legally, military support from countries who made sure it was forbidden to sell planes and weapons to the Israelis. Imagine Ukraine with no NATO support against 7 Russias and surviving. It is nothing short of a miracle. Then multiply that same situation, to some degree, to survive 4 other future major conflicts, this time with a bit more support from the world and a better trained army. In the end, it is very clear that statistically, a small group of people that make up 0.02% of the world's population should not still be here. We should have long ago been destroyed through exile and colonization, persecution and conversion, or violent hatred and war. But for some reason, we are still here. We are still practicing the same exact religion and tradition that our ancestors, who faced persecution and death, trying to defy empires. Our DNA can be traced through many generations of warriors, activists, and rebels. The picture that was posted by my friend and one of our biggest fans could not be more accurate. We have done more than just wrestled with giants and angels. We have overcome anything and everything that the world has thrown at us, because we are clearly the chosen people. There really is no other explanation. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.